Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the life you've been living is built on something fragile, something invisible, something you never questioned before. You open your phone. The familiar routine begins. Messages, news, social media, faces smiling behind carefully curated lives, advice about happiness, success, relationships. Everything appears stable, predictable, reassuring. But then a strange thought enters your mind. What if most of it isn't true? Not just the posts you see online, not just the opinions people repeat, but the deeper stories, the ones people tell themselves about who they are, what they believe, and why their lives make sense. What if those stories are lies? Not malicious lies, not the kind meant to deceive others, but comfortable lies. The kind that protect the mind from something far more dangerous than deception: reality. Now consider something unsettling. Human beings often claim they want the truth. We praise honesty. We celebrate authenticity. We admire people who speak the truth. But watch closely, and a strange contradiction begins to appear. Whenever the truth threatens our identity, our beliefs, our sense of security, something inside us resists. We ignore it. We rationalize it. We attack the person who said it. Why? Why do people who claim to value truth so often run from it? Why do entire societies build systems that quietly reward illusion? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, what if the human mind was never designed to seek truth in the first place? What if it was designed to survive? Because survival doesn't always require truth. Sometimes survival requires belief. Think about it. A person believes they are in control of their life, even when circumstances dictate most outcomes. Someone believes their relationships are stable, even when silent resentment grows beneath the surface. A society believes it is progressing, even when deeper problems quietly accumulate. These beliefs create psychological comfort. They give life a sense of order. But what happens when those beliefs are challenged? What happens when someone points out the contradictions, the illusions, the uncomfortable facts hiding beneath the surface? The reaction is rarely curiosity. More often, it's anger, defensiveness, denial. The mind quickly constructs explanations to protect itself. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort that occurs when reality conflicts with what we believe. But this explanation only scratches the surface, because beneath cognitive dissonance lies something deeper, something almost existential, a silent fear that if the lie disappears, the entire structure of meaning might collapse with it. Imagine discovering that the identity you've built your life around is incomplete. Imagine realizing that the beliefs guiding your choices were inherited rather than chosen. Imagine understanding that many of your desires were shaped by forces you never consciously recognized: culture, family expectations, social conditioning. At that moment, something unsettling happens. You're no longer standing on solid ground. The familiar narrative disappears, and suddenly you're confronted with a terrifying freedom: the responsibility to think for yourself. Most people never reach this point, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack curiosity, but because the cost of confronting reality can feel unbearable. Truth can destroy illusions, but illusions often protect stability. And this creates one of the greatest paradoxes of human existence. People say they want truth, but psychologically they crave certainty. Certainty feels safe. Truth often feels destabilizing. So the mind quietly performs a subtle trick. It filters reality. It keeps the parts that reinforce the story and discards the parts that threaten it. Over time, the story becomes stronger than reality itself. A belief repeated long enough begins to feel like truth. A narrative shared by enough people becomes unquestionable. And suddenly, the lie is no longer recognized as a lie. It becomes normal. But every now and then, something disrupts the illusion. a crisis, a failure, a moment of brutal self-awareness. In that moment, a person glimpses something unsettling. The comforting story they believed about their life might not be real. And now a decision must be made. Return to the comforting lie, or step into the unknown territory of truth. But here's the question almost no one asks. Why does the mind fight so desperately to protect comforting illusions in the first place? What ancient psychological forces are working behind the scenes? And what happens to individuals and entire societies when these lies become the foundation of reality? Because once you begin to see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. In relationships, in politics, in culture, even in your own thoughts. And once you notice it, you can never fully unsee it. But understanding why this happens requires going deeper into the hidden architecture of the human mind, into the psychological and philosophical forces that quietly shape what people are willing to believe and what they refuse to see. The preference for comforting lies does not begin in adulthood. It begins much earlier, deep inside the architecture of the human mind. Imagine a child slowly learning how the world works. At first, everything feels chaotic and unpredictable. The world is overwhelming, confusing, and full of unknowns. So the mind does something remarkable. It begins constructing stories. Stories about who you are. Stories about what people are like. Stories about how life works. These stories become your psychological map of reality. But here's the hidden problem. A map is not the territory. And yet, most people spend their entire lives confusing the two. Long before you consciously question anything, your beliefs are already forming, shaped by parents, culture, school, religion, media, and social expectations. These influences quietly provide answers to life's biggest questions before you ever ask them. What is success? What is happiness? What kind of person should you become? The answers arrive early, and they arrive with certainty. But certainty has a seductive power, because uncertainty is psychologically terrifying. This is where the philosopher Nietzsche made a disturbing observation about human nature. Nietzsche argued that most people do not pursue truth, they pursue stability. Truth can dismantle the structures that give life meaning. Stability protects them. In other words, people often believe things not because they are true, but because they are necessary. Necessary for identity, necessary for belonging, necessary for emotional survival. Psychology echoes this idea. The human brain evolved primarily for survival, not objective truth-seeking. From an evolutionary perspective, believing something that maintains social harmony or personal confidence could be far more useful than believing something perfectly accurate. Imagine two ancient humans facing uncertainty. One believes, everything will collapse, nothing makes sense. The other believes, my tribe knows the way, our traditions protect us. Which one survives more easily within a social group? The second. Belief creates cohesion, and cohesion creates survival. But this survival mechanism carries a hidden cost. It discourages radical questioning. The psychologist Carl Jung understood this deeply. Jung believed that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces that the conscious mind rarely acknowledges. One of his most famous concepts was the shadow. The shadow represents the parts of ourselves we refuse to see, the uncomfortable traits, impulses, and contradictions that threaten the image we want to maintain. Instead of confronting the shadow, the mind does something clever. It hides it. It pushes it into the unconscious and constructs a cleaner, more acceptable version of identity. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It simply operates in the background. This creates another powerful reason people cling to comforting lies. Those lies protect the image of who they believe they are. Imagine someone who sees themselves as a kind, rational, morally consistent person. Now imagine evidence emerges showing they acted selfishly, irrationally, or hypocritically.
At that moment, they face a psychological fork in the road. They could confront the truth and revise their identity, or they could reject the truth and protect the identity. Most minds choose the second option. Not because people are inherently dishonest, but because identity is fragile. And when identity cracks, something deeper trembles beneath it. Meaning. This is where the existential philosophers entered the conversation. The philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to freedom. At first glance, freedom sounds empowering. But Sartre believed freedom is also terrifying, because freedom means responsibility. If you are truly free, then you must take responsibility for your beliefs, your choices, and your identity. You cannot hide behind tradition, culture, or expectations. You must create meaning yourself.